The invasion of Sicily. From many ports, the mighty naval armada gets underway, ships flying the flags of Britain.
It was called liberation. The soldiers arrived under bright skies, cheered by some, feared by others. Guns fell silent, but something darker began to move in their place. Behind the sound of victory, doors were kicked in, fields turned cold with footsteps, and in the quiet corners of towns already broken by war, the real invasion began. Not with tanks, but with hands. Not in daylight, but in silence.
Shocking revelations expose widespread sexual assault within military ranks, sparking global outrage and demands for justice.
What happened next wasn't written into the treaties or speeches. It was buried under years of shame and denial. History moved on. The victims never did. Let's find out what really happened. The day the Allies landed.
Forming a swelling, flowing tide, whose billows are lashed by victory. The march began. The march to Rome.
The summer of 1943 brought more than heat to Sicily. On the morning of July 10th, the sea itself seemed to churn with war. Waves of steel approached the southern coast. Ships, aircraft, and thousands of soldiers, all part of the massive Allied offensive now remembered as Operation Husky. To the outside world, it was a turning point, a bold step into Mussolini's crumbling empire. But to the Italians living along those shores, it was the beginning of something far more uncertain. Townspeople watched from windows and hillsides, unsure whether to feel hope or fear. They'd seen occupation before, but this one came dressed in a different uniform. The Allies landed with confidence. British, American, and Canadian forces moved inland with practiced coordination. Behind them trailed dust, smoke, and more men, some regular, some less so. Rumors spread ahead of them as fast as the planes. There were stories of Moroccan regiments, foreign soldiers who didn't speak the language, who didn't wait for orders. Villages were swept up in the rush. Children chased candy dropped by troops. Others ran from the sound of boots on gravel. In cities like Gela and Licata, there were cheers, but not everywhere. In other places, silence. People stayed inside. Women pulled curtains. Fathers checked the door locks twice. The official version of the invasion was clean, strategic, victorious. But in the hills, far from the headlines, another version was already beginning. One that wouldn't make it into the textbooks. One where the line between liberator and conqueror started to blur. And in the coming days, that line would disappear completely. Morocco's soldiers and the curved daggers. They weren't part of the plan at first. The Moroccan WWIIs arrived as an extension of the French army. Soldiers from North Africa brought in to support the Allied push through Italy. They carried rifles like the others. But what made them different wasn't what they held in their hands. It was what they left behind. They wore their heritage with pride. Loose uniforms, curved daggers tucked into belts, and a silence that made people uneasy. Locals had never seen men like them. And when they came through the countryside, they left more than footprints. The French command had their reasons. The WWIIs were known as fierce fighters in the mountains, capable of moving fast and striking hard. That reputation followed them into Sicily. So did the stories. Strange ones at first. Whispers of missing jewelry, broken doors, and women who suddenly couldn't speak. Then came the truths. In towns like Capizzi and San Fratello, survivors began to piece together the pattern. The soldiers didn't always march in formation. They arrived in smaller groups, sometimes alone, sometimes at night. They didn't ask, they took. Not just valuables, but people, women, children, anyone who couldn't run or scream loud enough. Some carried strings of ears from fallen enemies, dried and worn like medals. Others dragged screaming men behind horses to show dominance. But none of that appeared in the reports. What mattered to the Allied command was momentum, territory, progress. For the civilians caught in the middle, there was no command to complain to, no law to turn to. The people who were supposed to bring order had brought something else entirely. The kind of chaos that doesn't end when the shooting stops. The kind that lingers in memory, shame, and silence. As the WWIIs moved north, word spread faster than they did. Families fled to the hills. Villages were emptied before they even arrived. Doors were nailed shut. Fathers stood watch with kitchen knives, knowing full well it wouldn't matter. Because by then, everyone understood. These men weren't following the rules. They were following their appetite. Capizzi and the whispered warnings. By the time they reached Capizzi, they were no longer just soldiers. They were legends, and not the kind anyone wanted to meet. Capizzi was small, winding streets, crumbling walls, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone. Word traveled fast there, faster than the Allied convoys, faster than official news. What spread through the town wasn't a celebration. It was dreadful. The first warnings came from people returning from nearby villages. They spoke in fragments. A sister is missing. A woman was found wandering with blood on her dress. Stories that no one wanted to hear, but no one could ignore. Some tried to prepare. Families hid their daughters in cellars and barns. Others packed bags in silence and left in the night, heading anywhere the roads would take them. But for many, there was no way out. The Gumiers entered Capizzi without resistance. They didn't come in tanks or columns. They drifted in, casually, like smoke. Armed, quiet, unpredictable. At the town's entrance, they began stopping civilians. Not for identification, not for safety, but for sport. Watches, earrings, and wedding rings were stripped away. If someone hesitated, the violence came quickly. There was one woman whose earrings were torn off so violently that she collapsed screaming in the street. An officer, watching from a distance, ordered punishment. The guilty soldier was tied to a horse and dragged outside town. Some took that as a sign that things might change. They didn't. The chaos didn't stop at the gates. It spread into alleys and courtyards, into the rooms where families prayed, and the walls were thick enough to muffle the screams. Capizzi became a place where no one slept, where windows stayed boarded, and children were told to stay still, even when hungry. In that town, for those days, the war was no longer a headline. It had a face, a smell, a voice, and it whispered things that no one wanted to repeat, but everyone remembered. The women who disappeared. Some left footprints, others left only silence. They were wives, daughters, and neighbors. Women who had spent the war keeping their homes together while the men fought or fled. When the Allies arrived, many believed it was over. The fascists were gone. The bombing had stopped. It felt like breathing again, but it didn't last. In some villages, the women were taken at night. In others, they vanished in daylight. Soldiers didn't always break down doors. Sometimes they knocked. Sometimes they called out a name as if they belonged there. Once inside, they didn't leave quietly. The records are cold and sparse. A number here, a location there. But behind each one was a body that bruised, a voice that stopped speaking, a life that changed shape overnight. Some women were found in the fields days later. Some were never found at all. The shame swallowed them. Families didn't talk. Husbands looked away. Mothers covered bruises with scarves and said nothing. A few tried to report what had happened. They were met with pity, or worse, silence from their own government, disbelief from Allied command. It was easier for everyone if the women disappeared again, this time into history. For those who survived, the war didn't end. They carried it in their skin, in the way they walked, in the way they never looked anyone fully in the eye again. Some bore children as a result. Others never had children at all. Villages gave them names behind their backs. Not all of them are cruel. Some were just trying to understand the things they couldn't explain. The phrase Moroccanate was born out of this, a single word to contain all the uncontainable horror. It became a shadow in conversations, a warning passed between women too young to remember, but too close not to feel. They say war ends when the guns fall silent, but for these women, it didn't. The violence came wrapped in foreign flags, spoken in foreign tongues. It came with promises of freedom and left behind broken people who would never know peace again. They didn't just disappear, they were erased. The Americans and the executions. Not all violence came in secret. Some of it was loud, carried out in daylight, witnessed, and still, It was buried. In the town of Gela, a group of Italian soldiers laid down their weapons. The fighting had ended for them. Some still wore their uniforms. Others had stripped them off and raised their hands. They didn't resist. They stood still, waiting to be taken as prisoners, the way the rules of war said it should be. Captain Compton didn't hesitate. He gave the order. One by one, his men lined the prisoners against a wall. Some begged, others just closed their eyes. Then the gunfire came. Bodies collapsed into dust. Those who survived the first shots were finished off with pistols to the head. No one intervened. Later, when the story reached the upper command, it was buried under excuses. Words like confusion, miscommunication, and stress. But the soldiers who watched it happen remembered every detail. They remembered the eyes, the trembling, the silence before the trigger. And this wasn't the only time. In nearby towns, surrendered men were mistaken for snipers, or labeled that way to make the killing easier to justify. The orders came down in whispers. No prisoners, no delays. Some said they came from General Patton himself, though nothing was ever written down. It didn't need to be. On the night of July 12th, outside a town in central Sicily, 5 Italian soldiers approached an American unit with their hands raised. They were shot anyway. 3 died instantly. The other 2 lay in the dirt, bleeding under a sky filled with stars, asking why. No one answered. The Allied campaign in Italy was supposed to be clean, a march toward justice. But justice doesn't leave prisoners in unmarked graves. It doesn't cover bloodstains with flags. And for those who lived in these towns, the stories never faded. They were passed down in kitchens and churches, always with the same ending. The men surrendered, and they were still killed.
Now first, like always, be sure to hit the like button down below. It helps us out tremendously with the reach of this video. Thank you.
Orders from above. No massacre begins with chaos. It begins with quiet permission. The violence that swept through southern Italy wasn't just a failure of discipline. It was something deeper, something systemic. And it often started long before a single soldier stepped into a town. The high command didn't always give direct orders to kill, but they didn't have to. Language did the work. Warnings, pamphlets, debriefings that painted civilians as potential threats or lesser people. The British circulated a manual to their troops before the landings, a cultural guide, they called it. But tucked between its pages were assumptions that would shape how soldiers acted. It described Sicilians as a people used to domination, used to bending to foreign powers. It warned of treachery. It offered suspicion, not understanding. From the American side, the message was less formal but more brutal. Some soldiers remembered a phrase passed around the barracks: "No prisoners." They didn't know where it came from. Maybe from Patton, maybe from someone trying to sound like him. It didn't matter. It spread, it stuck, and on the battlefield, it took shape. In the field, soldiers acted with impunity. If someone surrendered, they might live or not. If a civilian resisted, they might be looted or shot. The difference came down to timing, mood, and the silence of the officers nearby. There were moments when an act of cruelty could have been stopped, but often those in charge looked away. Some didn't want to report their own men. Others believed the violence was inevitable, the cost of breaking a fascist regime. In war, morals shift, lines blur. But some of those lines weren't just crossed, they were erased. And when the crimes came to light, the official record responded with what it always has: doubt, delay, and denial. When propaganda replaced reality, Castelnuovo al Volturno was not a battlefield. It was a quiet mountain town, far from the front lines. The kind of place where children played in dusty streets and old men gathered outside the church to talk about the weather. But in the fall of 1943, it was chosen not by chance, but by design. The Allies needed a story, a scene, something to show the world back home that the war was going well, not just in numbers, but in spirit. They wanted footage of a dramatic victory, house-to-house combat, liberation, the triumph of democracy. The problem was, no such battle had taken place there, so they created one. The townspeople were given a reason that sounded official: disease control. They were told to evacuate for 10 days so the military could disinfect the area. Trucks arrived. Families were loaded in and dropped off miles away, told to wait. When the town was empty, the real operation began. American soldiers returned, some dressed as Germans, others played the part of Allied liberators. Cameras rolled as tanks fired on empty buildings. Planes flew overhead, dropping bombs where no enemy stood. The streets were torn up for the sake of a perfect shot. By the end, Castelnuovo was rubble. The church collapsed. Homes were destroyed. The town was sacrificed not to war, but to the theater. When the villagers returned, they found their lives buried in ash and stone. There was no compensation, no apology, just silence, and a film reel that would later be shown in American theaters as a triumph. For the people who lived there, it wasn't fiction. It wasn't propaganda. It was a loss. Real, lasting, and completely ignored. Sometimes history isn't rewritten with lies. Sometimes it's filmed, edited, and sold as truth. Silence as a second death. What happened in Italy during the Allied advance wasn't just hidden. It was buried in archives, in government files, and most of all, in the voices of those who lived through it. Many women never spoke of what had been done to them, not to their families, not to their children. Some tried, early on, but the moment the words left their mouths, they saw what waited in return. Doubt, shame, sometimes even blame. And so the stories were sealed shut. Like the rooms where the violence happened, the silence wasn't just personal, it was national. Official histories focused on victory, on liberation. The soldiers were remembered as heroes. The crimes, if mentioned at all, were described as isolated incidents, misunderstandings. The cost of war. Italy, caught between its fascist past and Allied present, had little room to grieve publicly for what the liberators had done. Some survivors lived their entire lives with no recognition. Others were whispered about in their own villages, as if what happened to them had somehow stained their worth. In some cases, even the church, the one place many turned for comfort, stayed silent. But silence doesn't erase memory. It doesn't erase pain. It only sharpens it. To be violated is to be wounded. To be disbelieved is to be erased. And to be forgotten is to die again. What the survivors endured wasn't just physical, it was historical. They weren't just victims of war crimes, they were victims of a narrative that refused to include them. And in doing so, it made sure that what happened to them would never quite be real. Not in books, not in classrooms, not in the world's memory. The children left behind. Some women didn't walk away with bruises alone. They walked away pregnant. In the aftermath of the assaults, villages across southern and central Italy began to see the signs. A swelling belly, a quiet departure from town, a newborn with a face that matched no one in the family. For many of these women, the violence didn't end when the soldiers left. It kept growing inside them. Some gave birth in silence. Others were sent away to relatives in the countryside or to church-run homes, far from the eyes of neighbors. A few abandoned the children entirely, not out of cruelty, but out of desperation. These were children born of war, fathered by men who would never return and never be named. In some towns, people looked the other way. In others, they didn't. Whispers followed these mothers wherever they went. They were marked not just by what had been done to them, but by what they now carried. The children, too, grew up under that weight, treated with suspicion, with curiosity, sometimes with cruelty. Some were told the truth, most were not. They were raised as siblings, or orphans, or worse, as reminders. Their identities were shaped by secrets they never asked for. Many of these children were born into poverty. Their mothers had lost everything, their sense of safety, their homes, and their voice. And there was no help from the occupying forces, no support, no recognition, just another life left to survive in the ruins. By the summer of 1944, local health reports began noting a rise in cases of disease, syphilis, and gonorrhea, transmitted not through promiscuity, but through violence. Doctors kept notes. Authorities received them. Nothing changed. These children weren't recorded in history books, but they existed, they lived, and many still do. Proof that some invasions don't end when the fighting stops. They grow up. They walk the same streets their mothers once feared, and their silence, too, was inherited. Beyond Italy, the pattern of violence. Italy wasn't the only place where liberation came with a price. The pattern stretched far beyond its borders. Across Europe, wherever the Allies advanced, a different kind of violence followed in the shadows. In Germany, the end of the war brought not just surrender, but retribution. Up to 190,000 German women are believed to have been raped by American soldiers. The official numbers are debated. Survivors were silenced. Many never came forward, but the stories survived in whispers and in monastery records. The acts were hidden behind a narrative of justice, as if the guilt of a nation excused the pain of its daughters. The Soviet Red Army, too, left a trail of devastation as it pushed west. In East Prussia, in Danzig, in the streets of Berlin, mass rapes, looting, executions. Entire villages were emptied. Women were taken repeatedly, sometimes in front of their children. Some killed themselves rather than face another night. Others were killed trying to resist.
Väterchen Stalin gave his troops the right to rape, to steal, to kill, to do whatever they want to do. And believe me, they did.
In France, the Moroccan divisions, the same forces Italy had already come to fear, were deployed again. Towns in the south still carry scars from what they did. In Brock, Constanza, and Freuden, hundreds of women were assaulted in the span of weeks. As in Italy, the French command stayed quiet. Even British and Canadian troops, long seen as more restrained, were not without blame. In small German villages, elderly women were among those raped or murdered, not in battle, but after, when the fighting had already ended. Some of these crimes were punished. A few soldiers were court-martialed quietly. A few were executed, but most weren't. The greater goal, winning the war, drowned out the voices of the people crushed beneath it. These weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a pattern, a reality no one wanted to confront. Allied uniforms did not guarantee mercy. Flags didn't protect civilians. Liberation didn't always mean freedom. And while the world moved forward, rebuilding cities and writing treaties, the women left behind had no monuments, no trials, and no justice. Only the memory and the silence. A war with no heroes. History loves heroes. It builds them from rubble, dresses them in medals, and gives them clean stories with sharp edges. But war is rarely that neat, and in Italy, the truth refused to follow the script. The Allied invasion was supposed to mark the return of light, the end of fascism, and the beginning of freedom. That's how it was told in newspapers, in classrooms, in the decades that followed. But for those who lived through the occupation, the reality was more blurred. There were no clean lines between good and evil, no clear uniform that meant safety. Some American soldiers shook hands with surrendered Italians. Others shot them in the back. Some British officers handed out food to hungry children. Others allowed violence to unfold just outside their tents. Moroccan regiments marched under the French flag, praised for their bravery, even as the cries of their victims echoed through farmhouses and alleyways. It wasn't about one army or one nation. It was about what war does when no one is watching, when silence is easier than justice, when commanders choose speed over accountability, when the ones meant to protect are allowed to destroy because they wear the right patch on their sleeve. For many Italians, the war didn't leave behind stories of glory. It left behind broken homes, missing daughters, and fathers who died with their hands raised. It left behind shame, grief, and a deep distrust that lingered long after the gunfire faded. And in that space, the myth of the heroic liberator took root. Because it was easier to remember the parades than the funerals. Easier to speak of freedom than of what was stolen in its name. But no one who lived it forgot. Not the soldiers who pulled triggers, not the women who bled in silence, and not the children who grew up knowing that sometimes even the ones who win the war leave scars behind. Closing reflections. The war ended on paper. Flags were raised. Treaties were signed. Leaders shook hands. But for the thousands of women who had no graves, no trials, and no justice, the war never truly ended. What happened in Italy was not just a series of crimes. It was a chapter left unwritten, torn from the pages before the ink could dry, a history buried beneath the weight of medals and headlines. And for too long, it stayed there. Some will say these were isolated acts. Others will argue that war is messy, that things happen. But that doesn't explain the silence, the refusal to name what happened, the ease with which so many lives were erased for the sake of a cleaner story. We talk about liberation as if it were a light switch, darkness, then light. But for some, it was just a different kind of darkness, one with no uniforms, no orders, no end. And now, all these years later, we're left with fragments. Testimonies are almost lost, faces that never made it into history books, truths that make people uncomfortable, but they matter. Because remembering is the only form of justice left. And if we fail to speak for those who were never allowed to speak for themselves, then we let them disappear a second time. Not in war, but in forgetting.